back, everyone, to the Op Center, where we put a Wargamer's focus on historical conflicts. I'm your host, Ariskany, and in this episode we're continuing our 30th anniversary look at the Gulf War of 1991. In our last episode, we reviewed the background of the Gulf War and summarized the events that led to this fateful point of no return. Saddam Hussein's Iraq had invaded the small but wealthy oil state of Kuwait on August 2, 1990. The world had responded with UN Resolution 678, demanding that Iraq withdraw from Kuwait unconditionally by January 15th of 1991. Meanwhile, the United States had assembled the greatest coalition since World War II into Operation Desert Shield, initially a defensive measure to prevent the Iraqi invasion from continuing into neighboring Saudi Arabia. Now, the clock had run out, and January 15th had arrived. Operation Desert Shield was about to give way to Operation Desert Storm, a full-scale military counter-invasion to eject the Iraqis from Kuwait by force. This started with one of the most devastating air campaigns in military history, which is the topic for today's episode. The Desert Storm Air War was carried out by aircraft from a dizzying array of nations and armed services. The United States Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines were naturally all there, along with the UK's Royal Air Force, the Royal Saudi Air Force, the Royal Canadian Air Force, the French and Italian Air Forces, and the Air Forces of Kuwait, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. Commanding the air campaign was U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General Chuck Horner, under CENTCOM Commander General Norman Schwarzkopf. The number of coalition air units and aircraft types is staggering, so we'll just highlight a few of the more famous aircraft types here and talk about their specific role in Operation Desert Storm. The U.S. Air Force naturally had their two best fighter types deployed. First, we have the massive F-15C Eagle, 20 years old by this point, but still among the best air superiority fighters in the world. Deployed in larger numbers was the smaller, more nimble F-16 Fighting Falcon. Armed with modernized AIM-7 Sparrow medium-range and AIM-9 short-range air-to-air missiles and vectored to targets by E-3A Sentry AWACS aircraft, that's Airborne Warning and Air Control System, Falcons and Eagles would sweep the sky of any Iraqi air threat. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy had its F-14 Tomcat. Although famed as a dogfighter, the Tomcat also mounted up to 6 Phoenix long-range air-to-air missiles, capable of independently targeting up to 6 enemy aircraft from over 100 miles away, with a shockingly high kill rate. These Tomcats operated from carrier battle groups in both the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, allowing strikes to penetrate Iraqi airspace from virtually any vector. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps also flew the FA-18 Hornet in both the air superiority and strike roles, the Marines staging some of these on airfields in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. The U.S. Marine Corps also had their AV-8B Harrier, the American version of the British strike craft made famous in the 1982 Falklands War. These could operate off Marine Corps amphibious warfare ships, along with the aging but still devastating AH-1 Super Cobra attack helicopter gunships. Speaking of strike aircraft, the U.S. Air Force was still fielding F-4 Phantom IIs in the Wild Weasel air defense suppression role. There was also the Strike Eagle, the ground attack E variant of the F-15. We also have the A-10 Thunderbolt II, sometimes called the Warthog. Specifically designed to kill Soviet tanks in Germany, it's important to remember that the A-10 was actually on the U.S. Air Force's scrap heap by 1990. Fighter-dominated generals had relegated most of their A-10s to the Air Force Reserve and National Guard squadrons, or use as non-combat OA-10 forward air controller of all things. I mean, this sounds crazy to us now, but it was Desert Storm that sealed the A-10 status as one of the most effective purpose-built combat aircraft in recent decades. But if it wasn't for Desert Storm, the A-10 likely would have died as an odd duck footnote in aviation history. Finally, we come to the F-117A Nighthawk, the so-called stealth fighter. The media darling of the Gulf War, this of course was not a fighter at all, but a strike aircraft purpose-built to penetrate enemy air defense networks unseen and hit key command and control facilities, thus opening the door for other coalition aircraft. The Royal Air Force was also heavily engaged, primarily with the Tornado, including both the F-3 Interceptor and GR-1 strike variants. Jaguar and Buccaneer attack planes would reap a heavy toll among Iraqi ground units and infrastructure, along with Gazelle and Lynx attack helicopters. The French would commit a contingent of Jaguars along with Mirage 2000C multi-role fighters. The Canadians would have F-18 Hornets in action, while the Italians would deploy their Tornado interdictors. Saudi Arabia had its own potent force of F-15s, while Kuwait, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates contributed a mixture of Mirage variants, F-16s, and F-5 Freedom Fighters. The opening strikes of this gigantic multinational air effort were mostly aimed at the neutralization of Iraq's formidable and heavily fortified air defense network and radar sites, surface-to-air missiles, and gun platforms, all of which posed a deadly threat to coalition efforts to establish air supremacy over the imminent battlefield. American AH-64 Apache attack helicopters of the 101st Airborne are widely recognized as firing the very first shots of the Gulf War at 02:43 hours local time 17 January 1991. Guided by two Air Force MH-53 Spec Ops helicopters, they penetrated Iraqi airspace and took out key radar sites, clearing flight lanes for the first strikes on Baghdad. At the same time, the U.S. Navy cut loose with a barrage of Tomahawk cruise missiles from cruisers, battleships, and even submarines staged in waters all around the Middle East. These soared into Iraq from almost every direction, their terrain following guidance allowing them to hit more radar and command stations with pinpoint accuracy. Minutes later, Baghdad itself was hit by F-117A strike aircraft, escorted by EF-111 Raven electronic warfare platforms. An estimated 3,000 Iraqi anti-aircraft guns blindly filled the skies with flak, but the Nighthawks still took out the command stations that coordinated the whole Iraqi air defense network. And here's how the coalition neutralized the Iraqi air defense network, disassembling it from the inside out. Using special technology and tactics, they first took out the innermost command and control installations. These coordinate the sector command stations, which were taken out next. These in turn coordinate the radar sites, which were taken out next. And once these are gone, all these missiles and guns are largely blind, which rings the dinner bell for the rest of the coalition strike aircraft to positively tear apart the Iraqi air defense network. They then went on to the Iraqi army itself deployed in the field, a task set to with grim purpose for the next 5 weeks. Meanwhile, Navy P-3 Orions had detected Iraqi missile boats trying to sortie. The Navy and Marine Corps FA-18s and A-7 Corsairs sorted out that little problem. British and Italian Tornadoes joined the U.S. Air Force Strike Eagles and Navy A-6 Intruders on what they called Scud hunting sorties. Sometimes called in by special forces already on the ground in Iraq, these strikes destroyed as many of these intermediate-range surface-to-surface missile sites as they could find. This was a top priority among coalition commanders, since it wasn't known at the time whether these Scuds might be armed with chemical warheads. The Iraqi response to the stunning offensive was weak and disjointed, to say the least. Heavily outnumbered and hopelessly outclassed, their air force included a collection of older Mirages and Soviet-built aircraft like the MiG-21 Fishbed, MiG-23 Flogger, MiG-25 Foxbat, and most dangerously the MiG-29A Fulcrum. They also fielded a range of Sukhoi strike aircraft like the Su-22, 24, and the Su-25 Frogfoot we see in Team Yankee. Still, some coalition aircraft were brought down by ground fire, and Iraqi MiG-25 Foxbat fighters managed to shoot down a U.S. Navy FA-18 Hornet off the USS Saratoga on the first night of the war. 1 week later, Iraqi Mirages tried to bomb Ras Tanura oil fields in Saudi Arabia. These were met and engaged by Royal Saudi Air Force F-15s, who quickly shot the Iraqis down. Shortly afterwards, the Iraqis sent most of their air force, incredibly, to take refuge in Iran of all places, in the bizarre hope that they would be safe there and return after the war. Perhaps the most serious Iraqi response was the launch of their feared Scud missiles. One of these hit an American barracks in Saudi Arabia, resulting in the largest single loss of American life in the Gulf War. Others hit Israel, a cynical attempt to prompt an Israeli retaliation and thus threaten the delicate Arab coalition. Israel admirably refrained from any response, on the condition that the Americans provide Patriot anti-missile systems for Israeli defense. These air defense missile systems were loudly trumpeted at the time for their great accuracy in shooting down enemy missiles, but this success rate has since been called into question. Also, Iraqi Scuds were so badly built and maintained that they often fell apart during their descent. So multiple targets, like tumbling engines and warheads, would confuse Patriot radar, and these objects would sometimes get through. This was air war conducted in the information age, where the sheer amount of coordination and data management required almost defies belief. Especially during the crucial opening 30 minutes of the air war, that's 0243 to 0315 hours 17 January local time. Aircraft had taken off up to 20 hours before from at least 20 different countries and warships, some of them as far as the continental United States, and all of them had to arrive on time, on vector, and on target with split-second precision. Even after the air war shifted to hitting the Iraqi army, data control tasks like asset and strike management, navigation, air traffic control, bomb damage assessment, and logistics all had to be managed in real time, literally at the speed of flying jets. An absolutely impossible task in the age of push-token maps and grease pencils. This information management was handled by what Schwarzkopf called his Jedi Knights, the tech wizards in his command and control network. This was, in some ways, the birth of the internet, or at the very least, one of the first times it was ever used in a real-world setting away from college campuses. The air war in the Gulf was also the very first widespread use of GPS. So if you don't think the Gulf War affects your everyday life, remember this the next time you log into Facebook. For all its wild successes, the air war did have some pitfalls. Coalition pilots were shot down, captured, heavily beaten, and displayed on TV. Too many Scud missiles got through coalition air defenses, both in Saudi Arabia and in Israel, where they did terrible damage. And for all the dazzling smart bomb footage we saw flashed across CNN, please remember less than 1% of the tonnage dropped by the coalition was in any way smart or guided. And despite the successes of data management, there were episodes of air-to-ground fratricide, including an A-10 Warthog that ripped apart 2 British Warrior IFVs, killing 9 soldiers. There was also the question of overkill, most notably the Highway of Death, which we'll cover in part 4 of this series. Gaming in the air phase of the Gulf War offers, honestly, somewhat slim pickings. The system I would use is Air War C-21 by Wessex Games. The problem is that there isn't much in the way of historical air-to-air combat. We have the EF-111 Raven that executed high-speed evasive maneuvers so low that they caused the pursuing Iraqi F-1 Mirage to crash into the ground. Iraqi MiG-25s did shoot down a Navy F-A-18 Hornet outside of Baghdad, and Saudi Arabian F-15s shot down 2 Mirage F-1s trying to bomb those oil fields at Ras Tanura. Despite these isolated incidents, you can still have good air-to-air games here. Records do show that Iraq lost 259 aircraft in the Gulf War. 154 of these were on the ground, 105 of them in combat, and 36 were shot down in air-to-air combat. Meanwhile, that F-A-18 is the only confirmed coalition air-to-air loss, while the rest of the 75 Allied aircraft losses came from accident or ground fire. So there is some potential for air-to-air combat gaming in the Gulf War. Personally, I would recommend using Iraqi MiG-29As. These are roughly the equivalent to the American F-16. I would recommend giving the coalition the jump on the Iraqis to account for the shattered Iraqi command and control network. Also, please take the effort to have your victory conditions heavily slanted in favor of the Iraqis. Remember, only 1 coalition aircraft was lost in air-to-air combat in the entire Gulf War. So the loss of a single coalition aircraft in your Air War C-21 game should probably count as a coalition game defeat. So I'm afraid that's all we have time for in our Air War in the Gulf episode. I had to leave a lot out of this one, folks, so let's please keep the conversation going in the comments. Also, please stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll see Desert Storm's ground war erupt across the border. For now, this is Oriskany, and as always, Tango Mike for listening.